In this online lecture, I want to spend a little bit of time tackling a very big topic. That is, I want to try and spend some time attempting to define what Thatcherism is in advance of our lecture, which will look more closely at the record of Thatcher's governments. Now, it's not easy to define Thatcherism. Indeed, David Marquand has described Thatcherism as protean and elusive, and the debates about its character and nature has created, in some senses, a whole new intellectual subdiscipline within British political science. Now, I'm not going to be able to do justice to that enormous amount of scholarship in the time available to me in this online lecture. So what I'm going to focus on is a vision of two competing types of conservatism: progressive conservatism and Thatcherite conservatism. This is drawn from Ludlam and Smith's book on the Conservative Party. The table sums up these differing positions. It shows the progressive conservative position, often called the One Nation conservative tradition, that most people argue was the one which inspired the Conservative governments which held office between 1951 and 1964. In the other column, it shows the Thatcherite position, and what I want to do is basically go through each of those different elements. The first area to look at is in respect of change. A big area of tension in conservatism has been in respect of its views on continuity and change. The progressive One Nation position has taken what we might think of as a traditional conservative position. It accepts change where necessary, but such change, it argues, should be evolutionary and gradual. In contrast, the kind of Thatcherite neoliberal position is prepared to contemplate reforms which will rapidly and dramatically change society and reverse the pernicious policies which have been introduced by a long line of social democratic governments. Let's move on and look at the economy. Again, another tension in conservative thought is between the free market and state intervention. The progressive strand of conservatism has been in general much more willing to contemplate economic intervention to correct the defects and problems in the operation of the economy. Thus, in the post-war period, progressive conservatism was prepared to use the state as an instrument for securing economic growth. It was happy to tolerate public ownership of key industries, which it viewed was vital to the general health of the economy, and which it was thought might prove inefficient or unviable if left to free market provision. The Thatcherite strand, in contrast, promotes the use, wherever possible, of free markets and openly admires private enterprise. The role of the state for Thatcherism should be limited to providing the conditions for a free market. It should not plan or intervene in industry. There should be no subsidies, regional aid, or any of the policies which have been favoured since 1945. Instead, the invisible hand of the free market will prove much more efficient and effective than public intervention in and direction of the economy. Such intervention would distort market signals and prove inevitably and irredeemably inefficient. As should be evident by now, progressive conservatives had a very different view of the state to Thatcherite conservatives. They were much more happy to employ the state for their purposes. In contrast, the avowed aim of Thatcherism was to roll back the frontiers of the state. Thatcherism argued that during the years of the post-war consensus, the state had grown too large and unwieldy and had taken on responsibilities that it was not best suited to handle. Accordingly, the aim of Thatcherism was to reduce the state's responsibilities, to create a more limited state which would abandon the social democratic responsibilities which the state had accrued since 1945. In respect of civil society, progressive conservatism had a collectivist approach to viewing civil society. In contrast, Thatcherism took a very contrary position. It was summed up by an infamous quote which Margaret Thatcher gave, which was that there is no such thing as society, there are individual men and women, and there are families. Let's unpick this a little. Basically, what Thatcher was saying was expressing a position with the following premises. She believed that individuals always make much better judges of their own best interests than any paternalistic government could ever do. Secondly, she believed that individuals should take responsibility for their actions. For example, individuals should admit their own responsibility for their own situation. They shouldn't blame society, for example, for having committed a crime or for the fact that they're unemployed. Thirdly, individuals should be upright and self-sufficient. Individuals shouldn't scrounge off the state. They should, and if necessary be forced to, improve their lot by themselves. In respect of trade unions, progressive conservatives in the post-war period recognised the legitimacy of the trade union movement. They were seen as valuable partners in pursuing economic objectives, and it was seen as legitimate to involve them in discussions on major economic decisions. For Thatcherite conservatives, however, trade union influence was pernicious and responsible for Britain's ailing economy. Thatcherite conservatives argued that trade unions were too powerful, that they raised the costs of production with their unrealistic wage demands, and thereby create unemployment and economic inefficiency. Furthermore, they argued that an overmighty trade union movement was solely responsible for the prevalence of strikes in Britain. And so Thatcherite conservatism sought to detach itself and the trade unions from the state, to break the corporatist relations which had existed since 1945. Progressive conservatism was in general happy to accept the creation of the welfare state. It was an expression of the organic nature of society and the obligations owed to the less fortunate. It was also viewed as a means to the promotion of social stability. Provision of welfare prevented the emergence of more radical and threatening demands. A universal welfare state was therefore seen as a necessary feature of a just and stable society. For Thatcherite conservatives, however, the welfare state was to serve another purpose. It was to become in essence a safety net, a bare minimum of provision for those who could entertain no alternative. As with any institution run by the state, the welfare state was regarded as inefficient and as a dead weight on the productive economy. Moreover, it was an institution which discouraged the very individualism, autonomy and self-sufficiency which Thatcherite conservatism viewed as crucial. Finally, let's talk a little bit about morality. Progressive conservatives were paternalistic and held a concept of noblesse oblige. Progressive conservatives never questioned the assumption that there was a natural hierarchy in society and that social distinctions were necessary for order. Indeed, what they expected is that those in lower positions in the social hierarchy would defer to their social betters. However, it accepts that this natural elite has obligations as well as privileges. The governors therefore have a responsibility for the welfare of the people. They are in the best position to be able to determine what is in the welfare of the people. And it's summed up perhaps best in the phrase that the man in Whitehall knows best. In contrast, Thatcherite conservatism had a very different moral vision. The individualistic principles central to Thatcherite conservatism had little tolerance for a society organised on a rigid hierarchy and with a paternalistic elite that knew what individuals wanted or needed. Instead, Thatcherite conservatism was avowedly meritocratic. Individuals should not be frustrated in their ambitions by rigid social hierarchies. They should be free to rise to whatever station in society their talents and abilities could take them. Thatcherite conservatism also viewed individuals as legitimately self-interested with no sets of pre-existing social obligations. And this was something that was recognised by Kenneth Minogue, a political scientist with sympathies for the New Right. For Kenneth Minogue, Thatcherite conservatism represented a repudiation of bourgeois guilt and offered what he described as a kind of psychic liberation to the middle classes. So rather than feeling responsible for those less fortunate than themselves, Thatcherite conservatives sought to convince them and others that they need feel no responsibility or have any altruistic concern for others. Instead, they should pursue their own self-interests. Now that's all been somewhat abstract, and to really understand how these different principles operated during the period between 1979 and 1990, we will need to look in a little bit more detail at the policies of the Conservative governments led by Margaret Thatcher, and that's how we'll be beginning our next lecture.